So, welcome everybody, Mr. Kaeser, Dani Rodrik from Harvard, I assume. I have the immense pleasure to moderate this evening a debate between two men who have shaped the debate about reform of capitalism, what the future of it looks like, what works and what doesn't work. So we have Dani Rodrik, who is a renowned Harvard scholar, Ford Foundation Professor of International Political Economy at Harvard John F. Kennedy School of Government. And his research revolves around globalization and in particular around ways recently to make it more inclusive in developed and developing countries. And he's the author of Straight Talk on Trade, Ideas for a Sane World Economy, and it also already shows you that he thinks things may have to change in order for it to become sane. And here next to me is Joe Kaeser, who is has a long-standing career as a manager, CEO until February, or President and Chief Executive Officer of Siemens AG, so a big a titan of German industry. And he's now the chairman of the supervisory board of Siemens Energy. But most notably, he's also participated in the debate about major global challenges like climate change, digitalization, etc. Much more perhaps than other CEOs of Siemens before him. And so I'm very much looking forward to this debate. And Dani Rodrik, being a professor, is going to introduce us into the subject with a presentation so we can have a good starting point, and then I will raise my questions. Dani, the floor is yours.
Thank you, Nicola. I hope you can hear me. It's dangerous to give a professor the first word. It may go on forever. But I hope I will be more disciplined and just lay out a few thoughts. I was asked to talk for about 15 or 20 minutes. I hope not to exceed that. But I think what I'm going to say follows quite nicely from the discussion in the previous session, which most of which I was happy to listen to, and I think struck all the right notes from my perspective. I want to start my comments by focusing on globalization and how to think about a new globalization, although I will end by suggesting that in many ways the challenges of the future are not necessarily specific to globalization, but have much more to do with how do we create economies which are much better positioned to produce and supply adequate numbers of good, satisfying jobs for lower and middle classes. And in many ways, I think the rise of populism is in fact linked to the disappearance of good jobs. And we've heard this in the previous session, whether it is the collapse of industry in Eastern Germany after the transition, whether it's the China trade shock and its impact on local labor markets in the United States, whether it's the long-term impact of deindustrialization and decline of public services in Britain, the regional declines, spatial declines that show up in sort of the disappearance of good jobs, I think has been a key driver of populism and the rise of populist movements. Globalization has played its role, in some countries more than in others, but I don't think necessarily we should focus on globalization as the only source. And I think as we go forward, technological change and the institutionalization of labor markets are presumably going to perhaps play a bigger role. So I think we need to keep our eye on so where the issue is really, I would say, the supply side of the economy, the structure of the economy, and that's where I think our interventions will need to focus. But with respect to globalization per se, I want to start by saying that it wasn't that long ago when we thought that globalization was just a a fixed thing, and it's really you were either for globalization or against globalization. And I want to clarify that I'm presented sometimes as a critic of globalization. I'm a critic of a particular form of globalization. I don't think one can sensibly be against globalization per se. I don't think anybody in his right mind is talking about autarky or completely closing up economies. But we're really talking about what kind of globalization we want. It wasn't that long ago when political leaders told us that we were not even allowed to debate the form of globalization. Bill Clinton said in the early 2000s, globalization is not something we can hold or turn off. It's the economic equivalent of a force of nature, like wind or water. Around the same time, Tony Blair in Britain said, I hear people say we have to stop and debate about globalization. You might as well debate whether autumn follows summer. So these physical metaphors suggesting that globalization is something just falls into our lap in a ready-made form, and it's absolutely futile to resist it. And all that we can do is really adjust to it. Our societies have to adjust to this completely exogenous force. Is something that was very much in the narrative of the 1990s and 2000s. In fact, globalization can take many different forms. And in fact, in our own historical experience in economic history, we've had at least 3 different types of globalization. The gold standard was a very different type of globalization. Lots of labor mobility then, for example, you could go travel without a passport. Then we had after the Second World War, we had a kind of a Bretton Woods type globalization where the rules were much less ambitious. They really did not reach behind borders. And then after the 1990s, we've had a form of globalization, which I've called hyperglobalization, which in some ways went back to the gold standard understanding of globalization, where you increasingly societies were asked to conform to the requirements of the global economy and international competition, that they had to do certain things in order to be part of the global economy, as my quotes from Tony Blair and Bill Clinton, I think indicated. So in other words, the global economy became the end rather than the means for societies fulfilling their goals, such as full employment, full use of resources, domestic equity, and social inclusion, and so forth. So I think the key transition, I think, in the most recent period that took place in the 1990s is between sort of this earlier conception, the Bretton Woods conception of globalization, where essentially we viewed the world economy to be in the service of domestic economic political systems, to the post-1990 world, where in fact our domestic economic and political systems were asked to adjust to the requirements of a kind of a global economy. We see that in consequences of financial globalization and monetary fiscal policies becoming subject to the dictates of international capital markets, the requirement of international confidence. We see it in the international trade rules, the World Trade Organization, and variety of bilateral and regional trade rules, which went beyond the traditional preoccupation with tariffs and import quotas, but increasingly encroached on domestic policy areas such as subsidies, investment rules, intellectual property rights, sanitary and safety rules, environmental rules, and so forth. So I think we need to, I think the major transformation we need in the way that we think about globalization is really to reverse that ends and means relationship, go back to the post-war conception where the global economy was a means rather than as an end, and to think of the global economy and international competition as a means, as an instrument by which we should be, that allows us to attain our domestic economic goals. So I think this is not, doesn't mean that we should not have international rules or international agreements. I think they are important to discipline things like beggar thy neighbor policies or enforcing rules for global public goods. By the way, the most important global public goods are actually non-economic areas. There are things like global public health, avoiding pandemics as the COVID pandemic, or slowing down or reversing climate change. Those are probably the biggest areas where, in fact, we need more global governance, more global globalization of rules, so to speak, as opposed to the economic area. But I think in economic policy domains, I think the primary objective of our new strategy should be to ensure that domestic policymakers, domestic economic political systems have adequate room. They have the space within which they can recreate, if you will, domestic social bargains, prioritize the creation of good jobs economies that I was referring to, with globalization essentially being supportive of this rather than undercutting what governments have to do domestically. So I think globalization, a sensible globalization, one would be one that's of a much thinner set of rules on the international economic dimension. I think we can talk about the US-China, Europe-China competition. I think we will have to accept a certain degree of peaceful economic coexistence with China, understanding that we're in fact not able to change China's economic system, let alone its political system. And we should understand that countries, individual nations, have a right to protect their own standards, their regulations, their preferred tax regimes, but not necessarily a prerogative to export them or to enforce them on other countries. And we should be focusing on global governance on areas where economic gains are very large, as I suggested, and those are the areas where global public goods are particularly important, as I indicated. So all of this in terms of how we reconfigure globalization at a certain relatively high level of generality, but really this is the objective, is really to open up space for a domestic policy agenda. So in the earlier session, we were talking about Bidenomics. I think all countries have to figure out what their domestic project, domestic economic strategy is going to be. And that's really where the priority is. And I think here, this is where I'm putting my emphasis on sort of a set of policies that are primarily targeting the creation of good productive jobs for the middle classes. I think whether it's globalization, whether it's technology, whether it's the changes in labor market institutions, that's really the weakening middle, the squeeze in the middle is really, or the labor market polarization, as labor economists call it, I think is the fundamental sickness of our capitalist economies at the time. Now, it's important to underscore that the welfare state, which is the greatest invention, social invention of the 20th century, is extremely important, but is really inadequate to the task, because the welfare state was essentially built as essentially two planks. One is a set of pre-production interventions, investments in education, health systems, so forth, to prepare individuals for participation in the labor force, and a set of post-production redistributive instruments, transfers, income taxes, and so forth, to ensure that that people are subject to idiosyncratic risk or falling through the cracks, like getting sick or losing a job. They can be they have income support. Now, this is a fantastic system, but does not directly address the source of the problem when the problem is weak creation of jobs, when the problem on the economy is that for a variety of secular reasons, our sort of economic inequality and job insecurity are essentially a structural problem. And the welfare state simply treats the symptoms of this problem, does not treat the underlying problem. And again, this was an issue that came out in the previous panel where people said, the welfare state is not going to be adequate for this. And I couldn't agree more. So in a variety of writings I've been doing in the recent couple of years, I've been working with a number of different dimensions of this, and I would just very briefly identify 4 key planks of what a good jobs approach or what a productivist approach that directly targets this problem might look like. I don't have the time to go into the details, obviously, I'll just leave it on there. So if we can have maybe just a slide that has those 4, next slide, please. If we can have the next slide. The next slide, please. Yes, so I think these are essentially the 4 elements. One is that we need to consider and improve our present active labor market policies and make them much more linked, coordinated with employers, so that it's not just that we're providing the kind of training that is of the type that employers need, but that employers also recognize a certain responsibility on them, that their human resource policies, their employment policies also have to be shaped with an eye towards local labor market realities and availability of local skills. Second, I would emphasize significant overhaul of existing industrial and regional policies, which even though they often target employment or good jobs, the preferred instrument are subsidies to investment, subsidies to firms. And I think those ought to be reformed to target good job creation much more directly employment focused. Third, I think the most ambitious thing on this list would be thinking about our innovation and R&D policies as essentially shaped, directed by a wide range of public policies and public inducements, everything from the tax system, from the types of investments that public innovation agencies engage in, and that we need to move our AI, digital, new technologies investments in a direction that are much more friendly to labor, much more employment friendly, rather than incentivizing automation or AI tools and digital tools that are simply helping the most skilled employees and the largest platform firms. That's a wide open area where we have not even begun to think about, even though in a number of areas we understand, such as military technology or green technology, we understand the role of directed innovation. We have not put that idea of directed innovation with respect to labor market outcomes, employment outcomes as well. And finally, and here where I circle back now to what I started out with on globalization, which is that international economic policies that essentially provide a shield for this domestic economic agenda, because I don't think domestic protectionism or regional protectionism is the answer to a good jobs deficit, but we need to ensure that we have the right kinds of international economic policies that encourage firms to do what's up to them, pay their taxes, or also to ensure that domestic labor and social standards are not undermined by import competition from countries where the standards might be much, much weaker. So I think that's where ideas like anti-dumping, anti-social dumping would come into the agenda. But in order for those policies to work, you have to have the right kind of agenda. So I think all of these raise more questions than I have provided answers for. And I think with respect to the future of the globalization, I sometimes say that there is the good, the bad, and the ugly. The bad would be a collapse into the 1930s style autarky. I don't think that's likely. The ugly would be sort of continuing along the same path and assuming that we can revive the hyper-globalist consensus of the 1990s and 2000s. That's going to be ugly because it's not going to work. The good is a kind of globalization that actually opens up space and facilitates countries to pursue the right kinds of economic policy strategies at home and actually supports those policies rather than undermining them. So let me just stop there.
Yeah, thank you very much, Dani, for this introduction to the subject, and I'm going to dive right into it. I think the points you made were very interesting and very much fit, perhaps, your professional career in some ways, in the sense that Siemens moved from, when you started 40 years ago, from a company with many, that provided many good paying middle class jobs when you produced washing machines, dishwashers and telephones and many other things, of course. And now you've steered, well, the external conditions, but also you've steered the company full steam into digitalization. You do focus on smart infrastructure. So things that will require much higher skills, perhaps, than what you produced 40 years ago. And you probably don't provide the number of good paying middle class jobs than you used to. So what I would like to know is, how do you see a company, global companies that move into this direction? What is their role in ensuring, in this process that Dani mentioned, ensuring that the workers that work for you, but also more generally in the country, can benefit from such a development? So technological advancement, but perhaps also specialization through globalization, that they're on board and they can benefit from where the companies are going.
Well, I mean, we still, somebody still produces dishwashers. It's called Bosch Siemens appliances, but I think, first of all, Dani, thank you very much for, there's the camera. Somewhere here. So thank you very much for taking the time and bringing that up, because, besides, above and beyond the climate matter, what you have been referring to is certainly one of the most pressing topics of our time. And it has already, been developing over time. You talked about globalization. But the fact of the matter is you're only at the beginning of what one could say is a social divide, which is the fourth industrial revolution. And so what can companies do? I mean, look, it is not, we are not alone. We have the policymakers which need to set the framework. And then companies can act based on a framework. And the more global the standards are, the better off obviously everybody is, because it provides level playing fields for the companies to act. Now, if you look at the topic of companies, it's interesting because, Milton Friedman in the 70s had a very clear agenda for companies, and he said, look, the business of business is business. Or in other words, make sure that the shareholders get, the most value out of it, and stay out of trouble of politics and anything else. Now, what might have been the right thing to do in the 70s certainly is not cutting it anymore at all. We need to move from a true shareholder-based value into what I call stakeholder capitalism, or you could also call it inclusive capitalism. And that means that we not only look at the shareholder returns, but also look at the purpose. What actually is the purpose of a company? We need to go look at our customers, we need to look at our employees, and now we have a fourth stakeholder, and that is actually society. And when I was putting my last strategic program in place, which has been then splitting up the company in three: healthcare, industrial automation, software, and the energy, I said, as the purpose, a company needs to serve society. And if it does not serve society, it should not exist. What was, quite a courageous statement. And the only one way you can do this, you need to perform as a company, at least as well as your peers do. If you don't perform, as well as your peers in your industry, just don't even say a word about the greater scheme of what companies are about on purpose. I think that's the first lesson. Perform, and then you should actually engage in societal values. And there's a lot, it's not monocausaic. It's not like you need to do this and then it works like that. You've got a multilateral world. You've got the industrial world. You've got developing economies. You've got the global, globalization, which I actually believe is a good thing because that's been taking people out of poverty. Hundreds of millions of people, were moved out of poverty. Maybe it took a strain on the industrialized countries, on their society, because they need to share. But what right do we have to say we as industrial wealthy societies, we should keep everything by, on us and not have other poor economies, also people to give some wealth and some peace and all the nice things we have earned. So that's a general remark. I believe in terms of what can companies do, I think we need to be clear that a job is a value in itself. It is a societal thing. And the governments need to support that because they need to create the framework so that, taxes are not a decisive matter. Nobody should go some places because the taxes are lower. Then if you raise taxes, you would need, or if you lower taxes, you would need to see, is that lowering the taxes, is that creating jobs? Or is it making the richer, means the shareholders, even richer? Think about the US tax reform 2 years ago, 2 years ago, under Trump, or 3 years. Time is running. I actually have been congratulating him in Davos. I said, Mr. President, if you lower the taxes aiming at creating jobs in your country, this is a good thing. But if you look what happened, basically nothing but all those companies took the money and were buying back shares. That's not exactly what you ought to do by lowering taxes. So there's got to be a framework which helps the company to create jobs, meaningful jobs. So that's a general statement. Now, looking forward, if you look at the fourth industrial revolution, if you look at, the Internet of Things finally making it into a connectivity which is global, you talk about an extraterritorial scenario. And that actually makes it even more complicated going forward because our society is used to a territorial integrity. Our law is about a country with borders. Now, if the Internet of Things connects everything, what you see is that there's an extraterritorial economy shaping up. So that automatically means we've got to have a global understanding on how we pay taxes. So as such, I really like the idea of the Biden administration to have a global taxonomy. I mean, if you have us, Siemens, for example, paying about 30% or north of 28% taxes, and then the Apples and Amazons and Facebooks of the world pay 10, you need to go see where do they actually do business because they are extraterritorial in nature. So that brings a whole new set of tasks to the policymakers in the world. And we duly and truly do need a new WTO, where we put the extraterritorial character of doing business, into a set of multilateral rules. Otherwise, this society breaks apart. I could go on and on and on, but the topic is so complicated because there are so many different things happening at the same time. So the causation is very hard to find. And by the way, just talking about Siemens, in the last 5 years, only last 5 years, we hired 240,000 people. Some, of course, replacing others, but we would not have been, forced to do that. So if we had been really after maximizing the money, there would have been a lot of opportunities to do so. We're not doing dishwashers anymore, but we're doing, things that defeat cancer. We are doing things that lower the emissions by 50% in 3 years. So there are a lot of stuff which you could actually add as a purposeful company.
And just as a follow-up for the good job creation, so we saw these elements that Dani Rodrik highlighted, so active labor market policies, industrial relations, etc. So Siemens is in Germany, vocational education is very strong here. So how do you see the possibilities for a company like yours as technology advances to basically train the workers that are in the company to acquire new skills, to be able to master new technologies that have emerged? Or would you say that, you know, this has to be something that, well, people change jobs or?
Well, look, I think for Siemens is an easy thing, and for many other companies is an easy thing. The topic is actually, you know, how we put it one step or two steps higher to avoid what Dani was rightfully referring to, a further split of the society. I mean, that's the issue. Splitting, there's populism, there is split in society, there's nationalism. It makes matters even worse because you've got protectionism, and then you will fall back into poverty or losing of wealth. So the key element clearly is training and education. So the sooner you do that, the better off we are. And there is not just a private sector topic, there's also a public sector topic on education. They've got to set the framework. And, you know, if anything, you know, this whole pandemic is good for, it has brutally revealed, you know, the lack of state-of-the-art education in schools. It also has revealed that even industrial economies like Germany, for example, is way behind, you know, a modern way of online real-time teaching. And that brings you to the next subject, that not everybody can afford a few, you know, iPads or what have you, or can afford a hyper-fast internet pipe. So that's actually where the government needs to come in and set the framework. And it needs to be very clear. A government which is always half in, half out, you know, in the time of digitalization, doesn't do any good. So you have two ways to do it. Either you leave it to the private sector to do the internet connectivity, the pipes. Well, then you run the risk that, you know, those areas which are the rural areas, which are not highly populated, that they'll never get 5G nor 4G because they are so remote, and then nobody will invest because it doesn't pay. So that would actually call for the government to say, look, you know, everybody's got access to the internet, and that's a public topic. You take it away from the rich, give it to the poor. It would be perfectly fine. So you need to divide what's public sector, what's private sector. And then, you know, people will be able to do the application. We in Siemens, you know, then the private sector not only needs to develop innovation and application for the business model of tomorrow, the private sector has to, and this means the companies, they have the responsibility to basically retrain the workers. That's the single most pressing item we have at hand today, because, you know, there's sort of McKinsey studies and what have you, a lot of studies saying between 1 of 16 to 1 of 10 of the current global workforce will have to be retrained in the next 5 to 10 years. And COVID actually has probably pulled that in. You know, it goes quicker, it goes faster, because probably people were forced into doing something meaningful. So that means training, education, very clear task of the public sector on education, very clear task on the private sector to do the retraining of the current workforce. Much more important, by the way, than bringing back work from India or China or elsewhere, because that really doesn't help you a lot. If you bring back the jobs from Bangladesh, well, great. Then you have a textile industry here, and I don't mind to pay $5 more for a T-shirt or 10. That's fine. Problem is what happens to Bangladesh. You know, they fall back into even worse situations than what they used to have. So it's a complicated matter, but it's a joint effort, because if we don't solve that societal divide, which is only at the beginning, because if the internet reaches the industrial world, it gets worse. It gets worse because the internet is simple. It actually cuts out the middleman. It cuts out the weakest force of the value chain. People call it customer benefit. Sure, but the ones who've been cut out don't feel so good about it. And it's binary. It's not like you lose market share from 25 to 22%. Oh, well, you're still okay. No, you're not. You're going to be taken out of the value chain. It's binary, 1-0. So that means the societal divide goes even further. And that can only be sort of bridged by good education, by innovation, and looking for the next areas of growth, preferably in sustainability, because we don't have a planet B, so we need to go with something.
Right. Thank you very much. Then to look at the United States, so picking up on this theme, education and training that is needed, but also access to infrastructure for people to be able to be successful in a digitalized world. I would also like to dwell a little bit on another aspect of this that we've seen quite painfully in this pandemic. So the hollowing out. So one end, in terms of the type of jobs, quality of jobs, skills, where the number of jobs is increasing is of course high skilled on the one end, but on the other hand also service sector jobs, healthcare jobs, for example, that cannot be automized, cannot be brought offshore. And we've seen that often they are not very well paying, they're not very attractive, and I think the Biden one program of the Biden administration is also to make these jobs more attractive. So training is of course very important, but the service sector jobs. So what needs to be done about this element of the hollowing out of middle skilled jobs, if you will?
Yeah, I think that's very important, and I want to say a little bit about those service sector jobs, and then tie that to the question on technology, innovation, and education and training. That first of all, let me extend my appreciation to Joe Kaeser and I think his very important comments about both about the role of corporations and the need to think of them as entities with a purpose, as well as what he said about the role of jobs being a kind of a value in themselves. That is, that I think work does not define us, but it gives us purpose. And I think it's not only about the pay, although the pay is probably the single most important thing, but I think the life satisfaction we get from doing purposeful work, I think, is very important. And sort of in my definition of good jobs, certainly those broader aspects of jobs would be very, very important. Now, I think, Nicola, I mean, you're absolutely right that I think first, the bulk of jobs in the years ahead are going to be created in the service sectors of our economies: education, health, personal services, other services. That's really where the jobs are going to be created. Manufacturing industry, I think those are, they will remain important parts of our economies in terms of driving innovation and R&D, but they're not anymore sort of the driving, spearheading employment creation. So I think as we think about public policies for good jobs, it will have to be very different in some sense for how we thought about job creation 2 or 3 decades ago, or in the early decades of the post-war period, where it was really about global competitiveness, export champions, the most innovative manufacturing firms, industrial entities, and so forth. So the direction will have to be necessarily, if we take seriously the notion that our central deficit is, aside from our challenges on the climate front, our central deficit in capitalist economies is on the good job creation front, that our focus will necessarily have to be largely focused on services. Now, their public policies and government policies have a very important role in terms of establishing floors. on what kind of jobs and employment conditions. And I think so Biden's attempt to raise the minimum wage, his attempt to improve the ability of unions and the coverage of collective bargaining. I would take that all the way to thinking about in terms of sectoral, labor agreements, even when sectors that are not necessarily unionized or when unions are not well represented. Essentially, public policy has a significant role in establishing a certain floor on wages and work conditions, and that's an appropriate role for government regulation. But we need to understand, and here's where I'm going to come back to technology and education and training, that we can't just succeed simply by increasing our aspirations and raising the floor on wages and work conditions, because if we're not simultaneously creating the possibilities of productive employment in those sectors, simply raising wages and work conditions will mean that we won't be creating enough jobs. The private sector will simply shy away from creating the jobs that are required. So it has to be that as we target more good jobs creation in health, education, in other service sectors, we're also doing it in a kind of a productivity enhancing way. And here where I think we come back to sort of, one of my planks on sort of this good jobs program, that we are currently taking the R&D innovation efforts of our society is essentially completely exogenous, as if it was something that wasn't under our control, that it couldn't be used directly to augment the skills of less skilled, less educated workers in these kinds of middle skill sectors in our services. And in doing so, in treating innovation and technology as exogenous, I think we're in danger of making the same error that I started out by pointing out in the context of globalization, that we took globalization as a given, that there was nothing we could do to change its rules. And yet, I think in too much of our current narrative, it's all about, workers have to adjust and invest in education and training and skills and retraining. And, society has to adjust to technology. Well, if there's a gap between what technology requires and what society is able to produce in terms of skills, maybe some of the adjustments should fall also on technology, on the direction of technological change. So what I have in mind are sort of very concrete things like investing in digital and new technologies that actually augment the skills of less skilled teachers, less skilled health workers, less skilled service sector workers, because I think the greatest ally of increasing good job creation in those sectors is to create more customization, more ability to produce more differentiated services. For example, in education, by empowering less educated and less skilled, less experienced teachers to provide very customized education to different small groups of students according to their learning needs, having real-time information about how that is going. That process of customization, differentiation, niche services is both a way of increasing the productivity of some of the less skilled in the professionals, and also increasing the demand for their services because they are providing. So you can imagine that in the health services, and a lot of labor absorbing, but that's not necessarily happening because of the incentives and the norms and the narratives around technological change are not particularly geared towards these social problems. So our existing tax systems essentially subsidize investment in machinery, in capital, and they tax labor. So of course, you'll have innovation that's much more focused on replacing labor, automation. We don't have public innovation programs that are directly targeting new technologies that are going to augment skills and labor at the lower and middle part of the skill distribution in the way that I'm just suggesting. We just leave it to Silicon Valley to develop that kind of innovation programs according to their norms and their narratives around innovation. Similarly, I mean, relative power. I mean, who has the power within enterprises to have a word on what kind of innovation technology gets employed and adapted? I think if we were to raise the voice of workers and unions, I think we probably would see a very different pattern of innovation in the enterprise. Germany is a relative leader in this area, but I think there's a lot more that still could be done as we understand that the direction of technological change is directly impact society and it's not completely exogenous. And I think once we have that, we can start to experiment a little bit more about the various policies and tools that we might have in that area.
Is that something that speaks to you? So could Siemens develop more, or perhaps you already do that, rather than, well, having technologies that replace workers, develop technologies that augment their skills in some ways by customizing certain tasks? And if so, would you say, so what role do unions play in terms of shaping a little bit the type of innovation R&D that companies do, and what role should they play?
Well, let's say in terms of co-determination, as we call it, or unionizing in the US, and there's a lot of stuff going on in the US. I understand also in the Amazon case, and I think it was down south somewhere. The good thing about this German model of co-determination is that there is an interactive dialogue about structural transformation. And that's the best thing out of it, because those people are so close, to manufacturing, to the places where they come from. They represent their people, obviously, in the manufacturing and engineering, sales, anywhere, service area. So they know exactly what's right and what's wrong. That's sometimes much better than those management people in the ivory tower, not knowing nothing about what's going on in the organization. That's a good thing. If it gets complicated, if this co-determination becomes co-management, then it gets complicated. Reason being, that the workers' representatives in Germany are being elected by German workers. Now they ought to co-manage a global enterprise, which is, like in the case of Siemens, has 90% of its revenues outside the country. So how could they potentially, look at the greater good of the international company if they're being elected by people in Germany? So they would always look at Germany, right, first, and then see what else is there. Another good thing, and that is about co-determination and legislation, is that Germany has a lot of good tools to bridge temporary volatility. For example, in COVID, people, the companies pay into social welfare, into taxes, in order to have this, what we call short-term work. That means if you have a temporary fluctuation, people are not get fired, like we've seen in, for example, in the US, from almost full employment to 6 or 7 million people get, losing the job in 4 weeks. So we've been sort of, bridging that, which is good, because once the economy goes up, demand goes up, you got those people, and not look for them again, because you're typically scarce good. So that's a very positive. Downside of it is you got to be very careful to see what is temporary in nature and what is structural in nature. And if you try to bridge structural issues with temporary matters, you're actually losing time to restructure and reskill people's future. So it's not always, it's everything. It's not black and white. So you always need to go see. It depends on what is at hand. But then again, training, education, reskilling, that's what we really need to go look. In Siemens, we spend about $600 million every year for training, education, and reskilling. $600 million every year. A lot of money. And I'm actually, and Dani knows that I'm at the US Business Council. For some reason, we were invited because that put like 25 billion revenues in the US. And I have about 60,000 people there. And we had a discussion on same topic about a year ago. And I was on stage with prominent people like Bezos and the likes. And I was mentioning that, and there were a lot of CEOs in the room, you know. And I was mentioning that, and Alan Murray, the guy from Fortune, was actually moderating the session. You know them, right, Dani? And then Alan was asking and said, "Hey, Joe, what do your shareholders say if you waste 600 million of their money, which would actually be about 70-cent dividend per share?" And so I was sitting there, you know, as this European person, with all those omnipotent CEOs, Bezos and Jamie Dimon, all those big guys, right? Benioff and so on and so forth. All those legends. Nadella from Microsoft. And so for a second, I was holding my breath because I wasn't sure, should I just shut up and say, well, you know, or just say it. And then I thought, okay, here we go. It's Chatham rules, so let's get it out. And I said, look, Alan, if shareholders believe that's waste of their money, they better sell the shares. This is not a prison. And you could have heard a needle drop in the audience because obviously, you know, shareholders, Wall Street is everything. If you miss it by a cent, and so it was a lively debate about it. It was 3 years ago. Today, if you hear the Business Council people talk, they all talk about purpose. They all talk about stakeholder capitalism. So it seems that there is a movement in the understanding that's got to be something else than share buyback programs, than things like that. And so I'm very hopeful, actually, that the big leaders who are the movers and the shakers, you know, who are being listened to, not just whether Bitcoin is a good thing or a bad thing. I think that's a bad discussion. But, you know, about the general purpose of jobs, of being inclusive of society. So if that starts now developing, I'm actually pretty positive that the leading companies in the world will make that difference and others will follow. So there's not everything is bad, but we are at the 11th hour, or like in Germany, we say 5 minutes to 12. Or fourth and goal for the ones who do NFL, because if that Internet of Things now is really starting, and technology can do that already, you know, we have artificial intelligence, we have the tools, we can basically build from anything, can build a digital twin, even from people's bodies, brain, and then, you know, and optimize that digital twin and bring it back to real world changes. Now, obviously, in healthcare, there is the regulator and what have you, but on things we can do that. We combine the real world with the virtual world. With that, we probably cut the time to market, means the speed of innovation, in half. Time to market cut in half. The total, the cost for products, the design to cost, is probably between 30 and 50% cost reduction. So think about this, and that needs to be multiplied, you know, innovation and productivity, great customer value. But the question is, if that all comes to the workforce, and you cannot equalize it by growth, additional growth, they have a real problem, like a real problem. And we won't have self-driving cars on the street if we cannot integrate the social divide. We're going to have burning cars in the street and not self-driving ones. So that's actually what really keeps me up at night, on how to bring that together. So we need to create meaningful applications which, you know, are accessible to the next layer of demand by bringing the cost down for healthcare. Go from experience-based to knowledge-based healthcare. We've got probably bring it down 30, 50%, so more people can afford healthcare. the total cost for cars, for services. We need to bring the cost down so that more people can afford it. And that brings, the demand and supply together. Otherwise, they have a real problem because productivity is almost unlimited with artificial intelligence and have the digital twins on the real and the virtual world. And so then the question is, what will the regulator play? What will, let's say, the different global systems play? We have a clear systemic competition between the China model and the Western democratic model. And those are the questions which need to be solved. That means about multilateralism. That means that we have global rules of engagement in terms of the conditions of work. Yeah, don't go to Bangladesh because children can work, just a no-go. So we need to have international standards which need to be adhered to. And the same is, of course, true for sustainability. Mm-hmm. Otherwise, it's going to get complicated. We have a lot on our table.
Do these things you just mentioned, so human rights standards along international supply chains, but also sustainability, the green transition, is that something that states have to regulate, perhaps on a multilateral basis, or what are the rules of what can companies do to make sure that they they maintain those standards? So in Germany, we're talking about a supply chain law, and should it be mandatory?
First of all, I mean, the governments of this world need to set the rules, framework. Yeah, because it's got to be preferably a global framework. WTO reform could do that. If that doesn't work, hopefully there are multilateral agreements between the big economic powers in the world. So what can companies do? Well, companies can, first of all, make sure that their area of influence is 100% covered. And the area of influence means no matter which factory we are talking about in Siemens, whether it's Bangladesh, United States, Russia, China, we have the same rules. No children work, no forced labor, environmental standards, safety standards, EHS and what have you. So that's the minimum companies can do. And then the second topic, obviously, is that companies can force their suppliers, assuming they have a purchase power, their suppliers to adhere to the same rules. And that's what you call this supply chain law, Lieferkettengesetz. I'm a big supporter of it, as long as it's not that bureaucratic. It needs to be, practical. Because if you only have a responsibility, or if you're only accountable and not have a responsibility to check, it's no good. So I would say, any company, no matter what it's big ones or small ones, are responsible for their suppliers' conduct. And I would cut it there. To look at the supplier's supplier, come on, just cut it. I mean, make sure your suppliers adhere to it, and then we'll see what happens. So that's the type of stuff we can do, and enforce it on the supply chain side.
Dani, we heard that not only technology is really transforming things, but perhaps also globalization. And just to look at the change in administration in the United States, there are many things that have changed also in terms of economic policy. So Biden is suggesting a vast expansion of government spending on social programs, on infrastructure, also the green transition. He wants to also use public procurement to rebuild domestic supply chains. Janet Yellen, she's pushing also for the odds that we will have an agreement on a global minimum tax, corporate tax in the OECD framework have perhaps improved.
It would be really desirable.
Would you say that this is the kind of or shift of dealing with globalization and technological change that will bring about these good or focus on good jobs? What is happening in the United States there?
Well, I mean, I think it's clear that we're sort of in the midst of a transition, both an ideational one as well as a policy one. I think the global financial crisis essentially had significantly undermined the kinds of the economic paradigm that existed until that time. It's sometimes called neoliberalism, sometimes called market fundamentalism, Washington consensus. But there was a kind of a sense of the good rules of behavior for on the economic policy front, and it's clearly after the pandemic and with Biden coming to power in the U.S. I think it's quite clear in the U.S. that many of these that old rules don't apply. I mean, you have a Federal Reserve, a central bank in the United States today that's telling sort of economists, don't worry too much about inflation. That's the central bank. You mentioned many other policies, the Biden administration with sort of its fiscal policies, its Buy America policies, shoring up domestic supply chains, and so forth. So I frankly, I'm not sure. This is, there's certainly, I welcome kind of getting out of the box and trying out new things. Famously back in the 1930s, in 1936, when Franklin D. Roosevelt found himself president in the midst of a Great Depression, and his rallying cry was, we have to experiment. We find ourselves in a situation that's unprecedented. Our existing tools aren't adequate to the task, so we try and try. If something doesn't work, we try something else, and the only thing to fear is fear itself. And so it's I wouldn't necessarily describe Biden as today's FDR, but there's an element of that and getting out of the box. Now, would I sign up for everything that he's doing? I think that's sort of secondary issue. I think we can, but that would be, sort of rather sort of kind of ungracious. I think that we do need a change in our existing policies. I think Biden has provided a kind of a directional push that's certainly in the right direction. As we heard in the previous session from Tom Ferguson, I believe that it's not quite clear whether he's going to get his way with the Republican opposition and so forth. But I think directionally it's in the right way. Is that all going to amount to a new paradigm? I mean, I wrote a short piece a week ago called Beware of Economists Bearing New Policy Paradigms. So I'm not a big policy paradigm person. I think we just need to be flexible. We just need to understand that different circumstances require different policies. And if there is going to be a paradigm to come out of it, some future economists will describe it in 10 years from now, but it's, our ability to see it at present, I think, is very limited.
So we just, with Joe, we focused on international rule, the importance of something like a global corporate minimum tax, for example, but sometimes in these international negotiations, you don't get an agreement. And you mentioned how important it is still to not treat neither globalization nor technology shifts as natural forces, but saying you are able to shape them as policymaker, perhaps also as a country. But is that still true if we have this fourth industrial revolution, Internet of Things, etc.? How can an individual country shape, ensure minimum standards if we don't get these international rules?
I think they really do apply, and I think we would be again making a mistake by if we thought that the world is now so interconnected and technological possibilities so unlimited that either we have global rules or it's anarchy. I think national governments still have a big role to play, and frankly, when national governments decide to have rules that they want their own residents and their own nationals and their own corporations to uphold, but they don't get agreement from other nations. They have the full capacity and in fact obligation to go alone. I think a good area where we've made some progress, and I think most people understand that if Europe today is going to really go seriously and decarbonize its economies, right, that it would not be a good idea to allow other companies based in other countries to simply undermine decarbonization policies in the European Union by simply exporting goods made with dirty technologies, and that therefore you need something like carbon border adjustments what is a carbon border adjustment? It's a protectionist tool. You're putting up a tariff on an exporting country. But why are you doing that? You're doing that so you can protect in a good way your own domestic regulatory standards, your own your values, the value that you attach to slowing down climate change and speeding up the green transition. So that's a kind of a very vivid and I think well understood example of where if you cannot get agreement with your trade partners, you will have to do it and go it alone. And it'll look like you're actually engaged in trade restriction and protectionism. But that's the kind of protectionism that's good because it's protecting your own ability to uphold your own regulations and your own values. I think the kind of the rules on supply chains that you were just talking about is very much of the same kind. That there's no way that the United States and European countries will come to an agreement with China and many other countries on global minimum labor rights or human rights standards. I don't think that's likely. But that doesn't prevent from countries. I think France already has such a law. I take it that Germany is now discussing it. That if the political system, the nation as a whole, decides that we hold these human rights and labor rights as very important, and we don't want our corporations to employ workers under conditions that would violate internationally recognized labor rights and human rights, we're not going to allow them to do it, no matter where they are. So that's kind of extraterritoriality. I think it's also okay because we don't want to be complicit in human rights violations that are in which basically they are done essentially at our behest because they are our suppliers. I think there are many other areas, and in fact here I'm a bit of a maybe dissenter on the global corporate minimum taxation idea because there are some areas where in fact certain diversity may be okay. So if Singapore and the Ireland want to have low corporate taxes in their own jurisdictions because they believe in the value of low corporate taxation, it's not to essentially steal revenue from other companies. These are not tax havens in the way that, let's say, the Cayman Islands are. It's actually low corporate taxation that applies to real physical investment as opposed to the Bahamas or the Cayman Islands, which is just pure tax havens. I'm not so sure that there is a good argument that we should basically prevent them or we should force them to have higher corporate taxes because Europe and the Americans or other Europeans and Americans want to have higher corporate taxes. So there I see a bit of a trade-off. Now, if all countries can agree on a common minimum, fine. But I can certainly understand why Singapore, for example, is very uncomfortable in this discussion. And they say, well, in our jurisdiction, if we want to apply a different corporate tax rate, why should Siemens subsidiary in Singapore be subject to the same rules in Germany, even though they are essentially a Singaporean company. They're operating under my jurisdiction. They're a Singaporean company under law. So there is a bit more of a trade-off there that we need to think through. But to get back to your question, yes, I mean, the nation state is still very much alive, has significant powers.
Perhaps to come back to that idea, and you're overseeing Siemens Energy, of course. So the question of things like carbon, CO2 taxation, etc., is very, very important. How do you see this point? So are there possibilities for Europe, say, for example, if they wanted to go ahead with a higher CO2 taxes to protect that that policy program, if you will, with a carbon border tax adjustment, or do you often have to wait until you have the full international agreement? How about this tension?
Well, I mean, the downside is if you wait for a global agreement, you may wait forever. And companies, they've got a job to do. They have more to lose than an election. So we can't really wait that long. So it would be extremely desirable if, for example, Europe came together and said, look, this is our agenda, how we are going to reduce emission in Europe. And everybody in the whole world is invited to participate. And that's the set of rules if you want to do business. In the second biggest economy in the world, if you bring all the 27 together. And so this is certainly something where you make a policy. You're open to anybody to participate, but is that in Europe, if you want to participate, this is the set of rules. And any CO2 per ton costs you 80 or 100 euro, on sort of taxes. And what you would do is you take that money and make, and invest it into innovation or into structurally challenged industries to help them the transition. That comes back to the social sort of flooring that you provide opportunities without taking the responsibility of people's backs for their future, which is this non-conditional income, which is stupid because you've got to do something for your own employability too. There's a responsibility. That's the type of stuff. So, for example, green hydrogen. Green hydrogen will never work by physics if you don't have a CO2 emission tax. But that's got to stay for longer than 3 or 4 years, because if you invest into something today, you've got to have some sort of certainty on your business case. So that's the most dangerous topic typically if you depend on governmental rules and regulations, because somebody comes in and says, do away with all environmental, that's only invented by the Chinese. And then 4 years later, somebody comes back and says, oh, by the way, now we are going to be back in Paris. Okay, fine. Then what happens in the next 4 years? Well, maybe we are back to, I don't know, oil and gas or hydrocarbons. So this is really complicated. So you ought to have an understanding that this is the way you want to pave. And that's why I was so positive about, the United States coming back to the Paris Agreement, and hopefully have the COP26 and find a meaningful acceleration actually by a joint understanding on areas how to tax emission. And then, you can do what you want. You pay a higher price for emission and continue to be old economy. So the government would take that money and apply it to new innovations and new business cases on green technology. And this is how a government accelerates and forces transformation by using its framework, to benefit the ones who are up for innovation and to sort of penalize the ones who say, oh, well, it's always done the same way. And then on the SUVs, for example, in Germany, I would never prohibit people from, driving an SUV. I said, why not? Come on, do it. But instead of 1,000 euro taxes, you pay 5,000, and you take the 4,000 and help environmentally friendly technologies to come up to speed and provide a good opportunity. And if the 5 grand are not enough, in 2 years, it's 10,000. So you leave people the choice to participate, but their contribution to society would be those 10,000 euro, which are being applied to environmentally friendly technologies. That's the type of redistribution by still giving people the choice. And this is the type of stuff I think we ought to go look at and say, hey, you know, if you want to continue like that, this is the cost of doing business. And at some point in time, you know, the cost of doing business goes so high that the customers will change their priorities and their preferences. And then maybe say, you know what, if it's 15,000 per SUV, maybe I do all electric. Mm-hmm. So you would influence customers' choices, but not forcing them, not say, as of tomorrow, you're supposed not to fly short distances anymore. Well, just make it extremely expensive and then let people choose. And take that money, you know, you collect from the penalties and use it for environmentally friendly innovation or education or what have you. It's courageous. You may lose your job after 4 years as chancellor, but you do something good for society. Think about Schröder. I mean, he lost his job over the reforms, but that still, you know, is one of the most relevant sources in Germany why we are still doing okay, you know, as okay as we can. But we've got to have a second sort of reform now, which is structural in nature.
Excellent. I think, Dani, Joe Kaeser, we've had a very exciting discussion between a professor and a manager of a global company about what needs to change in order to tackle the challenges of globalization. I learned a lot. I wish we could go on for a long time, but I think we've run out of time. So thank you very much.